they've done some stuff that I don't agree with, and there's people in the party that have done stuff I don't agree with. But I don't think you could say that the party is anti-minority. I just think that they just have different views on things.
I mean, I agree that they have different views on things, but my point is that their views are anti-minority. And like you have even said so yourself just now, and I'm not sure if that was by accident or if it was just a manner of speaking, and I don't want to be bad faith, but you have said they like Cubans because they vote Republicans. So it seems like the buy-in is that for conservatives, for Republican Party to like you, you have to be voting for them. Otherwise, they seem to be fairly against.
Rose Mulet and KrysSpeaks. So I'm going to pull them up here.
Hello.
Mulet.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
Oh.
Hi. Hello.
Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you. Wow.
Right, let me just make sure that volumes are not completely fucked.
Your volume is good. It's a little roboty, but it's pretty good.
I can try restarting Discord, but it should be fine.
No, it should be. Yeah, you're good. And Rose, can I check your audio quality a little bit?
Audio checking. If you want me to take off my AirPods and we can test that, let me know.
No, it's perfect. Alrighty. Hello, our first good faith debate. So, just so that people understand the major shift that's going to happen in tone, good faith is going to be judged on concision, on organization, clarity of arguments, and the level of good faith. So the main thing we ask is try not to strawman, try to actually engage with what the other person says. Obviously, name calling is all going to be pulled against your score. So I know the topic is the Conservative Party becoming openly anti-minority? Who is arguing for which position?
I will be arguing that they are, and I believe Rose is arguing that they are not.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to give you each 1 minute opening statements, and you guys will have 13 minutes of open panel.
Sure. Who goes first in the opening?
Yeah, Krys, let's have you go first.
Right, yeah, sure. So I believe that the mainstream conservative movement is becoming openly hostile to minorities, including women, because of sort of the following reasons. So one, you've got both direct actions and dog whistling of mainstream Republican politicians. Two, you've got conservative thought leaders spreading bigotry and misinformation. Three, you've got the sort of mainstream Republican platforms and policies. And four, it seems like there is an overall effect that whenever an office of power becomes Republican, minorities just suffer. Now, I have examples for each of those, but I'm guessing that we'll get into that in the back and forth.
Awesome. Nice and quick. All right, Rose, a minute as well.
So I would say that there are definitely leaders in the conservative movement that are anti-minority. However, I would say that these figures are within the fringe, and I don't think they represent the average conservative voter. I would say that when you look at conservatives, they're more pro-minority than they've ever been. I went to a Trump rally a few years ago, and I saw gays for Trump signs. I saw women for Trump, Latinos for Trump, and I'd argue some of the policies, like against illegal immigration, for instance, right? I don't think that that's like saying that they hate certain ethnic groups or certain minority groups. I would say that that's just a policy that even some people of that minority might agree with.
Awesome. Okay, you guys have about 14 minutes now in total to have your open debate. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So we can do it one at a time. So for the fringe cases, I would disagree with that, just based on sort of, I would understand that point being the case if we were simply to look at sort of the actions of a few politicians who are saying something dodgy that can be sort of interpreted as being racist. But it seems to be the case that you've got entire policies and platforms like the Texas GOP releasing a manifesto with gems sprinkled throughout, such as describing homosexuality as abnormal, their opposition to validate transgender identity, their opposition to using public funds for diversity centers, and you've got sort of the general favorism of things like the broken windows policing in the Conservative Party, which is not only ineffective, but it tends to target minorities more so than anyone else. And just for the Texas GOP, that's like Texas in general is not a fringe case. That is probably the biggest conservative state in the US.
Okay. So what I would say to that is I would obviously disagree with everything that they said. However, I don't fully believe that represents the full conservative party, because I think if you see the outrage online, it wasn't just liberals that were saying that the Texas GOP thing was bad. I think you go to like any random conservative person that in your city, ask them if they agree with that insane stuff. I don't think that represents the majority of the population. I think the people in these towers, like I think that there is a problem with some divisions there. But I think to claim that the entire Conservative Party, or to claim that like the Conservative Party has this huge systemic issue of being against minorities, I don't believe that.
So to what you have said, I would probably agree to an element of it. So when you said that if you were to speak with a random conservative out on the street, they would not agree. And I would be completely on board with that. But the problem is that what a random conservative on the street might think might not be fully relevant in the scope of this conversation specifically. Because the thing is, if you vote red out of something like, for example, being against federal power, that is irrelevant if just that vote is the thing that allows the sort of Republican Party to establish discrimination against minorities. So an average conservative being against it isn't really, that would be a sufficient argument, if not for the fact that we already have tangible examples of the Republican Party being heavily against minorities, despite the fact that an average conservative might not be.
Yeah. Well, I would say that, I mean, like, look at Turning Point USA, right? Like, they literally had like a drag queen performer at Turning Point USA, and that's, I'm not even pro drag. I don't like drag. Like, but they literally have like gay people speaking there. They have people of different minorities speaking, and they're actually really proud of it. Say what you want about someone like Candace Owens. Like, I don't like her. I don't agree with her policies. I mean, you have someone like Blair White. Blair White is huge in the conservative movement. These are figures who would not have existed 10, 20 years ago, who conservatives would not have empathized with, agreed with 10, 20 years ago. Yet we live in a culture and a state where someone can be of these minority groups and yet be accepted within these groups or having the same systems and beliefs. And I do think that when that is the case, I don't think you can simply say that this political party is just anti-minority groups.
I think you could still, and I'm glad that you've used Turning Point USA specifically as an example, because it seems to be the case that we as a society, broadly speaking, are moving more towards the sort of accepting of people in general. So obviously the Republican Party has to adapt in order to not lose like too many voters, but I do not believe that trying to attract more voters to the party necessarily means that the party itself is in favor of those people that they are trying to attract. It's simply sort of a reactionary thing that we know that a lot of immigrants, for example, vote blue, so Republicans are trying to do something to get more immigrants to vote red. And even Turning Point USA being used as an example is a good one, because I believe it was during the last Turning Point USA that you had people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's a mainstream politician, refer to Asians as, and I quote, "yellow people love Trump." So it seems like that acceptance is incredibly surface level.
Yeah, I would say that like the way that she said that is definitely bad, and I think these people could definitely be more sensitive. I think if you look at the average person within each party, the average liberal is going to be more accepting minorities than the average conservative, right? I think that that's pretty self-evident. But that being said, I don't think that necessarily means that like conservatives are like anti-minority. Like for instance, like I'm partially Cuban myself, right? And I know that like Turning Point USA made a video talking about all the problems in Cuba. I know a lot of Republicans are very sympathetic and like pro-Cuban people because a lot of Cuban people vote like Republican. I mean, that's a minority, you know, a lot of people speak Spanish of Hispanic, Latino origin. I just think of so many examples where, or like Turning Point USA is like they're pro-Jewish, like they're pro like sending money to Israel. I can think of like all these examples. I don't know how you could see this and then say that the party is somehow like anti-minority. What I feel like, you know, they've done some stuff that I don't agree with, and there's people in the party that have done stuff I don't agree with. But I don't think you could say that the party is anti-minority. I just think that they just have different views on things.
I mean, I agree that they have different views on things, but my point is that their views are anti-minority. And like you have even said so yourself just now, and I'm not sure if that was by accident or if it was just a manner of speaking, and I don't want to be bad faith, but you have said they like Cubans because they vote Republicans. So it seems like the buy-in is that for conservatives, for Republican Party to like you, you have to be voting for them. Otherwise, they seem to be fairly against. And we've even seen this to a certain extent. Well, I suppose it would depend on whether you consider women to be minorities or not. But you've even looking at the recent Supreme Court and the abortion ban, you can see that like they're clearly not on board. And it's not just the matter of having a different outlook on life. You've got people like Clarence Thomas, who is a Supreme Court judge, saying after the abortion ban that they should next look at Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell, which are all, I believe aside from Griswold, court precedences that defend minorities. And it seems like it's just conservatives that are trying to push those back, or rather get rid of those. And just one last thing, and because I don't want to be going on for too long without giving you a chance to respond. But when you say that we should look at averages here, I don't think that works in this specific case. Because like looking at someone being on average against or in favor of something doesn't really matter if we're like having a systemic look, right? Because we're trying to look at the party as a whole. And if the party as a whole is, which I believe I can demonstrate with some like accuracy that they are anti-minorities, then it doesn't really matter what an average person within that party would feel like.
Well, yeah, that was the exact point that I was trying to make, though. Like, just because the average Democrat is more accepting minorities, that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, that was the point I was trying to make. And when we talk about abortion, I don't want to make this an abortion debate, so I'm going to make this really quick, right? Personally, you could argue that, like, oh, well, being against abortion is anti-woman. Personally, I do not see it that way because I see an abortion as preventing an innocent life from being born. Some people will look at that and they will say, oh, well, that person is like limiting women's rights. And I can understand that perspective. I just personally do not see it that way at all, because I typically value the life of the, potential human being, more than the kind of inconvenience of the person who has to carry it. That's just my opinion. So I personally just don't see it that way.
I respect that stance to a certain degree, but the problem that we have is that you could argue that being against abortion is anti-women. So I understand what you're saying when you say that you're pro-life and what you have just said. That is perfectly fine. But the problem that we have is that within a sort of democratic role, if you are pro-life, that is perfectly fine. You do not have to abort your child. You can simply give birth to them. Well, simply in parenthesis. But you can just give birth to the kid and you can be fine. You're allowed to be pro-life under the democratic role. But it seems like under the conservative role, you are no longer allowed to be pro-abortion. So it seems like you've got one party which is adamant at taking rights away, and one party which seems to be fine with individual and personal choice in the matter.
Well, the problem, though, is that this is, like, obviously, like, the left is going to prefer to allow, like, women to have abortions because they don't see abortions as a problem. They think people should have that choice. That's the whole point. Their whole thing is that people should be allowed to have it or not have it. Whereas the conservative view of this, or, not all conservatives feel this way, but like the pro-life people tend to think that, abortion is murder, or in my case, I wouldn't go as far as to say quote unquote murder. I would say, I think the better way to say is it's preventing an innocent life from being born. And I don't think that they should do that. So in the sense, the way that I see it is it's just something that prevents someone from being born. And when that's the case, that's not a case of like, choosing to let them, into this world. I don't think that that's a choice someone would have, but I don't want to make this an abortion debate.
I understand, and if that is the case, then we can move on to a different point, because we don't have to make this about abortion. We could, if you were fine with that, we could stick to the Texas GOP manifesto, in which, like, for instance, they refer to homosexuality as abnormal. Those are, like, that is a quote from the document. Like, that seems fairly anti-minority, wouldn't you say?
So I understand the sentiment behind that, but when I think that that's probably bad optics, but I think the term abnormal in itself doesn't imply anything negative. It's just saying that something isn't as common within the population. Even like everyone will admit, like the majority of people are not gay. I think the word abnormal probably isn't the best sounding, but I don't think that in itself is like indicative of, there being like this huge systemic, like conservative thing against minorities. Like I think there's probably better examples out there.
I mean, if there are better examples out there of the Conservative Party being anti-minority, then that would simply reinforce my point, though, right?
Well, yeah, but I could like, look at certain Democrats who've said something, or like, certain Democrats who believe like certain like social things, and like I don't think that would like reflect on the whole party as a whole.
I mean, and if we were talking about whether the Democratic Party is becoming anti-minorities, you could with full utility, but it seems like... So I understand the rebuttals that you're giving me, but none of those rebuttals go necessarily against the points that I am making. So like even with the Texas GOP manifesto, for instance, you would defend it by saying that abnormal doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation. I would argue any day of the week that it does, especially in this context. But the problem that you have is that it's not just that single example of the homosexuality being referred to as abnormal. You have a whole set of views that follows that as well, which is explicitly anti-LGBT. And an example of that would be that in the same document, they also outline their opposition to validate transgender identity and their opposition to using public funds for diversity centers. Now, you pair those together with the fact that they refer to homosexuality as abnormal, and I don't think that you could simply like jot it down to bad optics.
So, as a transgender woman, right, I could acknowledge that my state of being is abnormal. The vast majority of people will not be trans. I don't view that as hateful. I just view it as like a fact, and I think that that's cool, right?
And can I ask you a question? And because you're saying that you understand that, if I was to let's say I'm preparing for this panel and someone hops into my chat and I'm saying, Yeah, I will be talking to Rose later today about politics. She is trans and abnormal, but you know, it's we'll get past that. Like, would you not take offense to that?
Well, if I think the way that you're framing it's different. Like when you say that being trans is abnormal, like yeah, it is abnormal. When you say she's trans and abnormal, that applies that I'm abnormal for something else. If you make it clear that like yeah, you're abnormal because you're trans, it's like it's not the nicest thing in the world to say, but I understand it. And also, there was something else that you said that the conservatives were doing, like public funding
Opposition
to
to
like
valid.
diversity.
Oh yes, yes. So it was the opposition to validate transgender identity and the opposition to using public funds to fund diversity centers.
Well, I obviously I would disagree on the I think that trans identity should be validated, absolutely. But when it comes to funding diversity centers, like what are these diversity centers that we're talking about here? Because I've
So
had
I don't
experiences at
know
them.
of
I've never been a huge fan.
I don't know of any examples of diversity centers that would have been built otherwise, but I do know that within the same document, they're openly talking about funding centers that will, for instance, educate people about Western values. So it seems like the issue isn't with not funding like public centers. It seems like the issue is strictly with not funding centers that are relying around the LGBTQ ideology.
Yeah, well, I would say that, I mean, we live in a Western country. I believe in Western values. Not to say there's anything wrong with other values. It's just they have their values in their part of the world and we have our values in our part. And I think that it's totally fine and okay and preferable to prioritize the values of the people that live here. Now, I mean, like, I'm not against like LGBT spaces like being built. Like, I just never had a positive experience in them. I've always felt like an outcast in those spaces, even though it's supposed to serve me. And I'm sure like other people have had the same experience. I'm sure it can be helpful to some people. And, you know, maybe it wouldn't be the best thing to take those away. But from the experiences that I've had, it doesn't really faze me that much.
I mean, yeah, but so
Okay, I'm gonna
Okay,
pause.
sorry.
Sorry. No, no worries. I'm gonna give you guys 30 seconds for your outro statements. Thank you guys so much. You've done a wonderful job. I'm gonna start with Rose this time.
Wow, I don't even know what to say. Thank you for having me on. I would just like to say that, you know, conservatives, you know, I think that there's a lot of like lovely conservatives out there. There's obviously going to be some that might have some bigoted views, but I don't think we're going to accomplish much by assuming that they're all these hateful people. And I think we can build more bridges by seeing the humanity in them. And that's really my goal.
Okay, and 30 seconds for you, Krys.
Yeah, sure. So I believe that conservatives are very openly anti-minority. I believe that there are tangible examples of this happening. And while I do not have any issues whatsoever with conservatives on individual level, it seems like Republican platforms are just hella bigoted in general.
In the debate between KrysSpeaks
Oh,
and
she
Rose
is.
Mulet, that was a good faith debate. Is the Conservative Party becoming openly anti-minority? KrysSpeaks, the judges decided that you had won the debate.
Oh, big fucking
and we
pog.
have no feedback yet about Skylar and Lumi, but that will be coming up next. Just a reminder, all of these opinions that are being shared are not necessarily my opinion. So, you know, I take no ownership of any of them.